Hey guys, welcome to this video where we've been going through the solutions, the challenges in the C Sharp 11 expansion for the C Sharp Player's Guide. And this time we're going to be doing this challenge, the map. And the idea here is to get some experience with um, with converting an enumeration value into a string and how you might go about that. That's the main thing here. This is also going to get us a little bit of exposure experience with a 2D array. And you technically probably could do this without that. You could use a single dimensional array, just a plain old array if you wanted to. But in this case, a 2D array is just such a good fit for it. You could also use a jagged array. I suggest here create a 2D array. So that's my suggestion. You don't have to do it that way. Like I said, the main thing here is the enumeration, figuring out what text to display. Now, this is a pretty picture. Ours is going to look not so pretty because we can't use graphics. We have to use characters. So ours isn't going to look quite this pretty. We won't get the grid lines. Well, I mean, I suppose if you wanted to expand this challenge and do that, you're welcome to. But we don't need to do that. Anyway, the idea is basically we're going to take this map as it is, and we're just going to enter it in using an enumeration into our code, and then we're going to display it. And that's it. We don't need to load any of this stuff from a file or do any sort of user input or anything like that. This is just about converting an enumeration value into some sort of string representation, and B, using a 2D array. So let's jump into that. First thing I'm going to do is define an enumeration. And let's see, the types are water, mountains, land, and city. And then I'm going to make an array. So terrain, a 2D array. Let's call it map. This new. And again, I don't need to input this. I know the size. It's 4 by 8. And then I'm gonna if you need to go back to the book and review how to make a 2D array, that you should. It isn't. There are examples in there, and it isn't too bad. There's 4 of them. Oh, there's so many spaces in there. Anyway, so now I'm just gonna. At this point, I'm just gonna. I know the size, so I don't need to do anything fancy. I can just hard code it. It's 4 by 8. One thing people often struggle with is expecting getting your rows versus columns mixed up. So the thing that I find convenient in these cases is just figure out whether the order is going to be row then column or column then row or X then Y, and whatever it is, just figure it out right when you come in here and start doing this, and just make a decision and never do anything otherwise. I mean, you can do something different in a different program, but I've had that issue where in my mind I was thinking it's row then column, but then in a different part of the program I started doing X and Y, which are actually kind of the opposite. You always end up needing to do, because Y is up and down, and that's column. So it's row. So you end up doing Y comma X. Anyway, just figure out what you want it to be and just stick with that. But now all I have to do is come in here and just start adding the stuff. So terrain dot water. And by the way, I'm literally just copying, this is water, so I'm going to type in water. The next one's land, so I'm going to type in land. Then city, then land, then water, then land. Just all the way across all that. So nothing too weird or fancy. And now that compiler error went away because I actually have 8 across. Oh, I called that mountains, but when I wanted to use it, I called it mountain. I think I'm going to go singular. Not that that matters. But I chose mountain because when I was not like conscientiously thinking of it, I gravitated toward mountain, singular. So that makes me think that one might be slightly more natural. It also is one character shorter, for whatever that's worth. So there we go. We've got our map all sorted out. Hopefully it's right. Though if you make a mistake in that, like that's not the main point of it. So now I'm using an enumeration. I'm using a 2D array. Things are looking good. All I need to do now is display it. And this, to me, feels like a good place for a method. So I'm going to make a void draw map. I'm going to pass in the map. So I'm going to define that. I'm going to leave it empty for a second. But then once I create this, I'm just going to call draw map and pass in the map. So there we go. So the best way to iterate through a 2D array is just 2 for loops. And use this get length thing. So this is the length along the first axis, which would be this one. So this should be 4. And then for int column. Do that. And now we'll do, so we do want this to like, ultimately like what we want is something that looks like this. So water, it says to use the squiggly. And then land is empty. And then the city looks like a little dot. Land, water, water. Like ultimately, like that's the kind of thing we're going for here. So we need this all to be on one line. So we're going to do console.write rather than write line. And then we need to convert our terrain value to a string. So here we're doing conversion from enumeration to string. Now we could do that, except, sorry, I'm jumping around. I'm going to leave that as it is for a second and come back to it, but console.write line. So now we'll just display each of these things and then we'll finally wrap around to the next line here. The catch is, and we can see it, if I run this, like, what's this going to display if I just display the enumeration value? Well, here it is. Water, land, city, land, water, water. Like, that's not what I'm going for. Though, if I did some, like, formatting, I could get this to, like, look more, like, organized. Right now, it's kind of chaotic. So if I want to use the text, like, I could do that. But this is the main thing with enumerations is, like, their natural representation is what gets displayed when you just like display it. Like it's whatever is in the code. As a general rule, and you like, there are times where you might break this rule, but for the most part, you should not try and hack the enumeration names to get the output you want for a number of reasons. The main one for me is that that's not how it should work. There's a representation in the code that works one way, that is like, you shouldn't, what you want to show in the user interface should not dictate how you name things in, behind the scenes. This is a really, like, this example here, this terrain example really drives that point home well. Like I see people, for example, they want these, like they need to display water, but they don't want it to be capitalized. And so they'll come down in here and they'll say, okay, well, I'm going to make this be water, so it's not capitalized. Don't do that. capitalize it as it's supposed to, and then convert, like write code that will do the conversion. There's a lot of ways you can do it. That's covered in the C# 11 expansion. This is a good example of like why that's not just a good practice. And it is that like the symbols that we want to use like the squigglies for water, and we want to use empty space for land, and we want to use the little like parentheses for a dot for the city, and little caret symbols for the mountains. You actually can't name these enumeration values those things. Like they're not valid for an identifier. So it just doesn't work. And that's on, I chose this on purpose to like drive that home, that sometimes you need to just write code to convert it. And that's a totally legitimate thing to do with enumerations. And it works for any enumeration anywhere. You have complete control over what that enumeration value should look like. Because the alternative is some people will say, oh, well, since I can't get this to work right, I'm going to just make this a 2D array of strings. And then I'm going to put in, you know, you come in here and say, I'm just going to do string, and then I'm just going to come in here, and for land, I'm just going to do 2 spaces. And for water, I'm just going to do 2 of these. And honestly, there's a time and a place for that. Like but the catch here is that like now like that is valid. The program can't help you get it right. So it's possible for this to come in as any string, not just one of the ones that we've said is reasonable. So enumerations are a very useful tool. I would generally suggest don't just throw out the enumerations entirely just because you want to display it. Like you do want this. You just need to write the code to like display it. So what I'll do is I'll come down here and I'll say string. I'm going to call this get string. Maybe get string representation, which is kind of long. Maybe string is good enough, but I'm just going to give it a single terrain value. And then what we'll do is we'll call get string. So we'll convert it to a string as we go. And so now, for example, I could do, let me just do that. This is a very, like, this isn't what the challenge is supposed to do, but it gives you a feel for like what it's done. Like now I've got my little grid. I just need it to be the right text. So we convert it to a string when needed, when we're displaying it to the user. And this allows us to like operate like behind the scenes of like, well, can I traverse this? Well, if it's a city or land, yes, I can traverse it. Maybe I can't traverse mountains and can't traverse water. Or maybe it depends on what gear I've got equipped. If I've got, climbing gear, then I can traverse mountains. If I've got a boat equipped, I can traverse water and not mountains, or I don't know, like whatever that is. Like it gives you this flexibility to think about things at a logical standpoint without having this be like, well, I don't even know what strings are. The string could be anything. The enumeration limits you to just a handful of options, which is a super useful thing. So doing this conversion, and you can do it going from like your like logical representation to what you want to show to the user. And you can do a similar thing in reverse if, the user is giving you that data, or if you're reading it from a file, which is a topic for later for part 3 of the book. But all right, so all I need to do here is decide what string to use depending on the terrain type. To me, like we could use ifs, but this is ideal for a switch. So I'm going to say terrain switch. And like we could do string result equals this. I'll clean this up a little bit in a second, but we'll start with this. So terrain. So if it's terrain dot water, then we're going to return our 2 squigglies, our 2 tildes. terrain dot land. Well, I'll save land for the end for a reason. But so city is going to be that. Terrain dot mountain is that. And like I say, if you want to, these don't matter. If you want to use, if you feel a need, if you think a different symbol is better, go for it. I think a good example of that might be, maybe you got something you'd rather use instead of empty space for land. One thing, and this has given us a warning, the switch does not handle some values of its input type. It's not exhaustive. We have covered all of the values that are actually legitimate. There is a possibility that a non-legitimate value gets in here. And this, you read this warning, and it tells you that the switch expression does not handle some values of its input type, which is terrain. It's not exhaustive, involving an unnamed enum value. For example, the pattern cast the integer value of 4 to a terrain is not covered. I'm not doing that in this program. There's zero risk of that happening, so I don't need to worry about that. However, I actually, like, depending on what you're doing, it might be justified to handle that. In this case, I think it's pretty easy to just say, you know what, if it's anything else, we're just going to treat it as though it's land. So I'm just going to do that. Everything else, including land, is just going to be this. Now, if it wasn't land, if it were something, like if there were some sort of, I don't know, some subtype of water, a shoreline or a reef or something, then maybe presenting it as land is not ideal. You have to decide what you want to do about that. If I leave it off, if I make this terrain dot land and something weird, something new maybe gets in, then it'll crash. And sometimes that's preferable to like I didn't handle that, and silently failing and just pretending everything's fine and just presenting it as though it's land even though it's not. Could be worse. So you have to decide, and it's not easy. Anyway, so I got a return result here. And now that should work. I'll come back and do another small batch of cleanup, but now you can see I've got my map, and let's see how that compares. Bring this guy over. I think that looks like I got it all entered in correctly. So I think I'm done. Other than I do want to clean this up. So a couple of things I could do for cleanup here is, rather than storing this in a variable temporarily, I can just say return that, right? So it'll generate the value and then just immediately return it. Some people kind of hate this approach. If you do, leave the variable in there. I like it this way because it's simpler. But now that this is just return, like this is just an expression, I can use an expression body. And I think what is this? Yeah, use expression body for a local function. So if I just click on this and do it, it'll just convert it for me. Poof. Which got rid of an extra set of curly braces and some other stuff. So this is, I think, a good, I like this. Like I said, some people, it's too much packed in because you have an expression body that immediately is a switch, and then you got all this stuff. And like these curly braces don't belong to the method, even though they kind of look like they do. They're actually part of the switch. A lot of that is personal preference. Like, I like this. I think this is a great way to do it. But if it doesn't jive with your personal preference, do it differently. It's fine. However, this messed up my formatting here, didn't it? Personally, I like aligning those. To me, the code looks clearer. It looks like a little table. You know, this stuff maps to this stuff. This goes in, this comes out, and I like that. So, all right, that is it for this. Well, let's just check some things out here really quick. So define an enumeration to represent the 4. We got the enumeration, create a 2D array. We've got that. Write a method to display the map. We've got that. Set up your main method to call your new method, passing in the map array. We've got that. 2 nested for loops are a good way. Yep, we are done. So that is it. That is 150 XP. And yeah, so like I said, switches, enumerations, like this is a good example of how you might use an enumeration. This is also a good place where you might use a 2D array. And like I said, we could have done it this way. But to me, it's just like I need to make even more tweaks here to get this all set up right. I love the 2D array. The downside is they are marginally slower than the other options. There's almost no scenario where that matters, or that amount of performance difference matters. But somebody who needs to squeeze every last little drop of performance out, you might want to look into whether whether changing something like that makes a difference. Like I said, I'll bet it won't usually. Like that won't be the thing that saves you, but it might be. So yeah, 2D array, tuples, or not tuples, enumerations. And like I said, this gives you some experience with this, like conversion from an enumeration value to a string. Like if we wanted to display, maybe there's a little, like we could do town, and then it'll display that instead. Like whatever the text is, like we can just do that here. So those are the main elements of this challenge. Hopefully this shows how you can go about that. But that's everything for this video. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you guys in the next video.